I've sat on that bench for over 20 years, and I've watched a lot of people walk into my courtroom thinking they were untouchable. But I still remember the morning a woman in a coat that cost more than most people's cars looked at me and called my courtroom a joke. Before I tell you what happened after that, let me ask you something. Have you ever met someone so used to getting their way that they forgot other people existed? My name doesn't matter as much as what I've learned in this job. I've heard every excuse a person can invent. I've watched grown men cry fake tears over parking tickets and watched grown women smile through lies so smooth they almost believed themselves. After enough years on this bench, you stop listening to what people say first. You start watching what they do while they're saying it. I walk into my courtroom the same way every single day. I don't rush. I don't perform. I read every file before I sit down because the file tells me the facts, but the person sitting in front of me tells me the truth. Those two things are not always the same, and learning to tell them apart is the whole job. I have rules I live by in that room, and I don't apologize for them. I don't care who you are outside those doors. I don't care what car you drove here in or what your last name means to other people. In my courtroom, everyone gets the same chair, the same questions, and the same standard. I've found that the people who respect that the least are usually the ones who need it the most. What gets my attention fastest is arrogance, not confidence. Confidence is fine. Arrogance is different. Arrogance is when someone thinks the rules are for other people. I can spot it in the first 10 seconds, sometimes before they even open their mouth. It's in the way they walk in, the way they look around the room like it's beneath them, the way they answer a question with a sigh instead of an answer. What I respect more than anything else is honesty, even when it's ugly. I have seen people admit two terrible mistakes and still leave my courtroom with their dignity intact because they told the truth and owned it. I have far less patience for people who try to talk their way around the truth like it's an inconvenience. That kind of person always slips eventually. They always do. That morning started like most mornings. Coffee, files, a short walk down the hall that I've walked so many times I could do it with my eyes closed. But something about the case list caught my eye before I even called the first name. It was a simple dispute on paper, a contract, a payment, the kind of case that usually takes 20 minutes. I had no idea it would turn into one of the most unforgettable mornings of my career. The first person I saw enter my courtroom that day was a woman named Marisol. I remember her name because of how she said it, quiet, careful, like she wasn't sure she deserved to take up space in the room. She was maybe 40 years old, with hands that looked like they had done real work for a long time. Her jacket was a little worn. At the sleeves, her folder of papers was held together with a rubber band instead of a binder. I noticed the way she sat down, straight back, knees together, hands folded tightly in her lap like she was holding herself in place. I've seen that posture before. It's the posture of someone who has been nervous in official rooms her whole life, rooms where she felt like she had to prove she belonged. She ran a small renovation business, nothing fancy. She and her husband did kitchens, bathrooms, small additions, the kind of work that keeps a family afloat but never makes anyone rich. She told me later that she built that business from nothing, one referral at a time, one satisfied customer telling a neighbor. I could tell she hadn't slept well. There were shadows under her eyes that makeup couldn't fully hide. When I asked her to state her name for the record, her voice shook slightly on the first word, then steadied. That told me something too. Nervous, yes, but not weak. People who are truly dishonest rarely shake like that. They're too busy performing to feel real fear. I let her talk. That's something I always do whenever I can. I let people talk long enough that the truth starts to show itself, whether they mean for it to or not. Marisol explained that she had been hired to complete a full renovation on a guest house, not by an ordinary homeowner, by the wife of a man whose name you would probably recognize if I said it, though I won't, because that's not the point of this story. Let me ask you something, because I think about this a lot. Have you ever done everything right, followed every rule, kept every promise, and still ended up the one who got hurt? Marisol told me that she had used almost every dollar of her savings to buy materials for that renovation, trusting that she would be paid once the work was done, exactly as the signed contract promised. She hired 2 extra workers for the job. She turned down 2 other clients because this one project was supposed to be big enough to carry her business for the rest of the year. She finished the work on time. She finished it well. She had photographs, timestamps, receipts, everything laid out neatly despite that worn rubber band folder. And then, according to her, the payment simply stopped coming. I looked through her evidence while she spoke, and I want you to understand something about how I read a file. I'm not looking for perfect grammar or perfect paperwork. I'm looking for consistency. I'm looking for whether the story someone tells matches the paper trail they hand me. Marisol's story matched page after page, receipt after receipt. That was when the courtroom doors opened again, and the second person in this story walked in. Her name was Danielle. I'll never forget the sound her heels made on that floor, sharp and unhurried, like the room existed to wait for her. She was maybe 15 minutes late, and she didn't apologize for it. She didn't even seem to notice. It was worth mentioning. I noticed her phone was still in her hand as she walked to her seat. I noticed the way her eyes moved across my courtroom, not with nervousness like Marisol's, but with something closer to boredom, like she had accidentally wandered into the wrong waiting room and was deciding whether it was even worth staying. She sat down without being asked, which normally isn't a big deal, except for the way she did it. She dropped into that chair like it was a piece of furniture beneath her, like sitting there was already an inconvenience she was doing everyone a favor by tolerating. I've learned that you can tell a lot about a person before they say a single word. The posture, the eye contact or lack of it, the way someone treats the people around them when they think no one important is watching. Danielle barely looked at Marisol, not with anger, with something worse, indifference, like Marisol wasn't quite a full person to her, just an inconvenience with a folder. I opened the case and read the basic facts aloud, the way I always do, so both sides know I understand exactly what we're here for. I explained the contract, the amount owed, the timeline. When I finished, I looked at Danielle and asked her to respond. She let out a small sigh before she even opened her mouth. Then she said, and I remember this clearly, I really don't understand why this is in a courtroom. This feels like a lot of drama over some cabinets. I did not react right away. I never do. I let a small silence sit in the room, because silence tells you more about a person than a question sometimes will. Danielle filled that silence herself, the way people like her usually do, because silence makes them uncomfortable when they're the one being watched instead of watching. Look, she said, things got delayed on my end. Life happens. I don't see why she couldn't have just waited. I asked her a simple, direct question. I asked whether the contract had a payment deadline that had already passed by the time we were sitting in that room. She waved her hand slightly, like the question itself was tiresome. I mean, technically, sure, she said, but contracts are more like guidelines. Anyone reasonable would understand that. I want you to sit with that phrase for a second. Contracts are more like guidelines. I have heard a lot of excuses in my career, but that phrase stuck with me because it told me exactly what kind of world this woman believed she lived in. A world where rules bend for people like her and stay rigid for people like Marisol. Be honest with me for a moment. At this point in the story, would you still be staying calm? I asked Danielle whether she was aware that Marisol had used her own savings to buy the materials for that job. She shrugged, actually shrugged, and said, "That's kind of the risk you take when you're in that line of work, isn't it?" I looked at Marisol when she said that. Marisol didn't say anything, but I saw her jaw tighten, saw her hands press flatter against each other in her lap. She wasn't performing pain for the room. She was trying very hard not to show it at all, and that restraint told me more than tears ever could have. The case file included message threads between the two women, screenshots Marisol had printed out and organized by date. I began going through them out loud because I wanted both sides to hear their own words read back plainly, without any tone or excuse attached to soften them. In the early messages, Danielle sounded friendly, even warm. She used phrases like, "You're so talented and I trust you completely." But as the renovation neared completion, the tone shifted. The messages became shorter, colder. Then came a message where Danielle wrote that she was reassessing the value of the work, despite having approved every single stage of it in writing beforehand. I looked up from the papers and asked her directly. I said, "You approved this work in writing at every stage, and then you tried to reduce the payment after it was finished. Why?" She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and said, "Because I could. I mean, I didn't put it that way to her, obviously, but people renegotiate all the time when they realize they're being overcharged." I asked her what evidence she had that she was being overcharged. She didn't have an answer. She had a feeling. She had an assumption. She had the confidence of someone who had never once in her life needed a receipt to justify what she believed. That was the moment I understood exactly who I was dealing with. Not someone confused about a contract. Someone who believed that money gave her the right to rewrite reality whenever it suited her. Do you think people like that hear themselves when they talk, or do they truly believe the world owes them a different set of rules? I turned back to Marisol and asked her to describe what happened after Danielle stopped paying. Her voice was steady now, steadier than it had been at the start, the way people sometimes get once they stop trying to hold everything in. She said that she had reached out repeatedly, first politely, then more firmly, explaining that she had bills of her own, workers to pay, a family depending on that income. She said Danielle stopped responding to messages entirely for almost 2 months. Then, out of nowhere, Danielle sent one final message. I asked Marisol to read that message aloud because I wanted the room to hear it exactly as it was written, in Danielle's own words. Marisol's hands trembled slightly as she held up the printed page. She read that Danielle had written that she could make this go away quietly, but that if Marisol tried to take this further, she would make sure no one in that industry wanted to work with her again. The room went still. I felt the shift immediately, the kind of shift you learn to recognize after enough years on this bench. This was no longer only about unpaid work. This was about someone using power to threaten another person into silence. I looked directly at Danielle and asked if she remembered sending that message. For the first time since she'd walked in, she hesitated. "I was frustrated," she said. "People say things when they're frustrated. It's not like I actually did anything." I asked her to clarify whether she believed threatening someone's livelihood was simply saying things, or whether she understood that intimidation has consequences, especially when it's aimed at someone with far less power to fight back. She didn't answer that directly. Instead, she said something that I think about even now. She said, "I don't understand why everyone acts like I'm some kind of villain here. I have a lot of people depending on me too. I have a reputation to think about. What would you have done, sitting where I was sitting, hearing someone compare her reputation to another person's entire livelihood?" I asked to see the full financial records related to the project, including bank statements showing when funds had been available. Danielle's lawyer, sitting beside her, shifted uncomfortably, the kind of small movement that tells you a professional in the room already knows where this is heading before their client does. The records were clear. The money had been available the entire time. There was no financial hardship, no missed paycheck, no genuine confusion about the amount owed. The funds simply hadn't been sent because Danielle had decided on her own, without any legal basis, that she didn't feel like sending them. I read one line from the bank statement aloud, the exact date the full amount had been sitting untouched in an account, 3 days after Marisol finished the renovation. I looked up at Danielle and asked her to explain that timeline. She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time all morning, she didn't have a quick answer ready. I watched her shift in her seat, watched her uncross her arms and recross them the other way, small movements that told me the performance was starting to slip. Do you think arrogance always gets louder right before it finally breaks? "I was going to pay her eventually," Danielle said, her voice a little less steady now. "I just wanted her to understand that she doesn't get to dictate terms to me." I asked her plainly whether a signed contract counts as dictating terms, or whether it counts as an agreement she had willingly made and then chosen to ignore. She didn't answer right away. The silence in that room felt different now, heavier, the kind of silence that happens when a person realizes the room is no longer on their side. I turned to Marisol and asked how this experience had affected her business. Her voice cracked slightly for the first time. She explained that she had nearly lost her workshop space because she couldn't make rent for 2 months straight. She explained that she had to let one of her 2 workers go, a man who had a young daughter at home, because there simply wasn't enough money to keep paying him while waiting on funds that never came. She said something I will never forget. She said, "I didn't just lose money. I lost the ability to keep my word to the people who trusted me." That sentence hit the room harder than any raised voice could have, because that's the real damage arrogance does. It doesn't just take money. It takes a person's ability to be who they promise to be to the people depending on them. What would you have done if you were sitting where I was sitting, hearing something like that said? Out loud? I turned back to Danielle. Her posture had changed completely from when she first walked in. The confident slouch was gone. Her hands were now pressed flat against the table in front of her, the way people press their hands down when they're trying to keep them from shaking. "I didn't think about it like that," she said quietly. "I just thought it's not that much money to me, so it shouldn't be that big a deal to her." I let that sentence sit in the air for a moment before I responded, because I wanted everyone in that room to fully absorb what she had just admitted. She hadn't withheld payment because of a disagreement. She had withheld it because in her mind the amount was too small to matter to her, without ever considering what it meant to someone else. I asked her one final question before I moved toward my ruling. I asked whether she understood the difference between an apology made because she got caught and an apology made because she actually understood what she had done. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes moved down to the table. Her breathing had changed, quicker now, shallower. The physical signs of someone whose control over the room and over herself had completely slipped away. That is always the moment I watch for most closely, because that is when you finally see who someone really is. Underneath the performance, fear and regret are never the same thing, and after 20 years on this bench, I have learned exactly how to tell them apart. "I'm sorry," she finally said, her voice much smaller than it had been an hour earlier. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." I looked at her directly and said, "You didn't mean for it to go this far because you didn't expect to be held accountable. That is very different from being sorry for what you did." The room was completely silent. I let my gaze move slowly from Danielle to Marisol before I spoke again, because a moment like that deserves to be felt, not rushed. I said to Danielle plainly that having money does not give anyone the right to treat a signed agreement as optional. I told her that a contract is not a suggestion for people who can afford lawyers and a favor for everyone else. I told her that threatening someone's livelihood to protect her own comfort was not a misunderstanding. It was a choice, and choices have consequences in my courtroom, regardless of what she was used to outside of it. I ruled in full favor of Marisol. I ordered the complete payment owed under the contract, along with additional damages to cover the direct financial harm caused by the delay, including the lost wages Marisol had to pay out of her own pocket trying to keep her worker employed as long as she could. I made it clear on the record that the threatening message sent to Marisol would be formally noted, and that any further attempts at intimidation would be treated as a separate and serious matter entirely. I looked at Danielle one final time and said something I still believe with my whole heart. I said that respect is not a luxury item reserved for people who feel like offering it. Everyone in this world is owed it, and no bank account has ever been large enough to buy an exception to that rule. This is why I still believe truth matters. More than status, do you? After the ruling, the courtroom slowly began to empty. I watched Marisol gather her worn folder, the rubber band still holding it together, and I saw something in her posture that hadn't been there at the start of the morning. Her shoulders were a little straighter. Her steps were a little steadier. Sometimes justice doesn't erase what happened to a person, but it gives them back something just as important, which is the simple confirmation that what happened to them was wrong, and that someone finally said so out loud. I heard weeks later that Marisol was able to rehire the worker she had let go. I heard her small business slowly began to recover, one referral at a time, the same way she had built it in the first place. As for Danielle, I never saw her walk into my courtroom that arrogant again. People like that rarely do, once they've been forced to sit across from someone who refused to be impressed by them. I think about this case more than a lot of others I've heard, because it wasn't really about cabinets or contracts at all. It was about the quiet belief some people carry that consequences are something that happen to other people. It was about a woman who worked hard, kept her word, and almost lost everything because someone with more money decided her word didn't matter as much as her own convenience. I've learned after all these years that character shows up most clearly in the moments no one is forcing you to be good. Danielle didn't break the law because she needed the money. She broke her word because she believed she could, and that belief is far more common and far more dangerous than most people realize. So now I want to ask you something honestly. Do you think I was too hard on her that day, or do you think she got exactly what she earned? If you had been sitting where I was sitting, hearing everything I heard, what would you have done differently? I would really like to hear your thoughts, so leave me a comment and tell me honestly how you would have handled it. And if this story meant something to you, if it made you feel something you weren't expecting, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you. There's another case waiting for you after this one, and trust me, it says just as much about people as this one did. In the end, I've learned that money can buy a lot of things in this life, but it has never once been able to buy respect, and it never will, not in this world, and certainly not in my courtroom.